meeting tonight. I'd like to welcome everyone. Thanks for coming along to tonight's meeting, The West and China on the Brink, Will the New Cold War Turn Hot?, hosted by Stop the War. My name's Chris Nineham. I'm the Vice Chair of the Stop the War Coalition. And I'm very pleased to be talking tonight with Jenny Clegg, who's a China specialist and a former senior lecturer in Asian Pacific Studies, as well as being an officer of Stop the War. And it's obviously a very important meeting, and it's an important meeting for all the wrong reasons. It comes just 6 days after the group of 7 most powerful Western economies met, bizarrely, in Hiroshima in Japan, given the nature of the meeting. And in a move that probably would have made George Orwell shudder, they called it a peace summit, when in fact it was dominated by, as you probably all know, by a discussion of escalation against Russia and crucially escalation of China, the great power or the big power in the region. And shamefully, Rishi Sunak was amongst the most hawkish of the world leaders gathered in Hiroshima. And he in particular called China the biggest challenge to global prosperity and security. So it was a kind of snapshot of the place we are unfortunately in at the moment. It takes place, or it took place, against the background of a relentless increase in tension in the region and a constant and really rather chilling brinkmanship on the part of the Western powers, including the statements or a kind of contest, a speculation between senior US military figures as to whether the war with China will start in 2025 or 2027. So it's a very dangerous situation. It's a very frightening situation, and it's one that the anti-war movement, both here and internationally, needs to take very seriously. And that's why we've called the meeting tonight. That's why it's great to welcome so many people to it. And the way that we want to run the meeting is that I'll ask Jenny to introduce for about 15 minutes to give a kind of overview, including a bit of a geography lesson, which hopefully will be useful. Maybe some of you know it already, but maybe not. And then I'll have a few questions that I want to raise with Jenny, and then we'll throw it open to questions from you all. And if you want to ask a question, put your hand up at the end of our little conversation, and put your hand up, obviously, in reactions, or you can send a message in the chat to the host. You can do either. But we obviously encourage you to speak if you want to from the so-called floor. So without further ado, welcome again, and I'll ask Jenny to introduce. Jenny Clegg.
Hi, Chris. Thanks very much for that introduction, and hi to everybody. Thanks for joining. As Chris said, yes, it is a very tense and precarious situation. I think the nadir was the balloon incident, where, a Chinese spy balloon was seen as an enormous threat to the United States, never mind, the 400 bases US bases that surround China, slightly disproportionate. I think that, casting our minds back to the very beginning of the Stop the War movement, I think we all suspected that something like this might happen. We saw the US bombing the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. We heard George W. Bush in 2001 identifying China as a target for US nuclear weapons. And over the last year, since the war began in Ukraine, there's been this constant linking of, we're being told that the European security and Indo-Pacific security are tied up together, and Taiwan could become the next Ukraine. And, in the bigger picture, the war in Ukraine is taking place amidst this massive shift in the balance of power from west to east, which makes the situation that we're in much more complicated. So I hope that we can come back to some of these questions But I just want to talk a bit about the geography and a bit about the history. I can remember when the Americans went into Afghanistan, I had to look at a map to see which countries bordered on Afghanistan. And I think I wasn't alone in that. I think George W. Bush had to do that as well. So anyway, so let's just start off and share. Okay, so here we have the beautiful blue Pacific, which of course is not just an empty ocean, it's full of little islands. And in actual fact, it's got a population of around 2 or 3 million on the islands, who have been living for millennia off the fish, the abundance of fish and the abundance of vegetation and fruit. And have been crisscrossing the Pacific for centuries. But there's also another dimension to the Pacific. And here we've got a map of the US, what is the Indo-PACOM, Indo-Pacific Command of the US military. It's based in Hawaii, which is just here. The command has about 400,000 personnel scattered across, and it's also a base for important base for US nuclear submarines. We can cut across to Australia with the US base well established in Pine Gap in Darwin. And down around here, just a few miles north of Sydney, is going to be the base for AUKUS. That's at Wollongong, where there's a university that can provide all the AI and quantum computing backup for that. Then we can move across to the Solomon Islands. This is a very strategic point in terms of trade across the Pacific and to South America. And there's a lot of diplomatic contention around the Solomon Islands at the moment. I think that our Foreign Minister, James Cleverly, visited there a couple of weeks ago, and it's the site of a very big battle, the Guadalcanal battle in World War II. And then we can move up to the Marshall Islands. If anyone saw that film by John Pilger, The Coming War with China, he focused a lot on how the Marshall Islands had been where around 300 nuclear tests had been carried out by the US and the UK, and the impact, this was in the 1950s and 60s, and the impact that this had on the local people in the islands. And there's about more than 20 US bases in the Marshall Islands. Then we can come across to Guam, which is an interesting place. It's a relatively large island. It has a population of about 200,000 indigenous people. It's actually it's owned and run by the United States military. And there are 2 bases there, and they've just built a third. The Northern Marianas Islands, this is also under US command. And there's a small island of Tinian, which is where the Enola Gay set off with its nuclear payload for Japan. And they're just now renovating that base there to carry nuclear bombers. Up to Japan. Japan and South Korea have about 80,000 US troops between them. And just off South Korea, Jeju Island, which is just about here, not so far from China's big cities here. That was just built recently as a major naval base. And then we have Okinawa, which has most of Japan's US military based there. And of course, there's been quite a lot of opposition to, you might have heard about the opposition in Okinawa and Jeju Island to the American bases. And then we come down to the Philippines, where the US has just agreed access to 4 bases in the northern Philippines. So we can see here between Okinawa and the Philippines, how the US is tightening its grip on Taiwan, which is just about 100 miles from the Chinese coast. You know, you can see how important it is strategically, so, and around here as well, there are lots of disputed waters, seas and islands. First of all, the Kuril Islands up here are disputed between Japan and Russia. We mustn't forget that Russia is also a Pacific power. And then the small Diaoyu or Senkaku Islands are contested between China and Japan. And then the waters between China and the Philippines, obviously the South China Sea, is contested as well. So there's plenty of disputes that are going on. This line here from Japan to Taiwan to the Philippines is known as the first island chain. It was called the first island chain. This was part of the chain strategy that was adopted by the US in 1950 to the main line, as it were, to contain Chinese and Soviet influence. And then we have the second island chain, which moves through the Marianas, Guam, down to Papua New Guinea. And I forgot to mention there's a base also being built there. So we can see how the US is really consolidating its military in the first and the second island chains. So, so here's an interesting question. Who owns the Pacific? That might sound like a crazy question. And I talked about all of the islands here. You think that Pacific would be owned by the people. Oh, no. Who owns the Pacific? Oh, there's quite a lot of contention around the South China Sea, which the Americans call the West Pacific, which is here. And the Chinese are said to claim ownership of this. In actual fact, the size of waters that are claimed by China dwarf in significance to those claimed by the United States. So large chunks of the Pacific Ocean are owned by the United States. They're also owned by France, because France still controls the New Caledonia Islands, and also the size of the Pacific claimed by the British is about the same as the size claimed by the Chinese, because down in the south we still control the Pitcairns. So when you compare all of the attention that's being given to China in the South China Sea, and yet nothing is said about the colonial control of the Pacific Ocean. So next I want to talk about some of the history about the Pacific as a war theatre. And here we have the World War II, and we can see how this was fought out between the US and Japan all over the Pacific Ocean. Of course, the World War II really started with Japan's invasion of China in 1937. And it's interesting, we should recall this when we're talking about, you know, how would a world war start? It starts at different points in different places. Obviously the war was fought on two fronts, and the dynamics of the two fronts were very much interrelated. The World War II ended in Europe earlier, and as the Soviet Union turned to fight Japan, turns its attention towards Japan, it was at that point that the US dropped its nuclear bombs on Japan and basically secured its military interest across this part of the world. Now, the other thing is that, as I was saying, the two fronts were interrelated, and it was the aim of the Japanese and the Nazi Germany and the Italians to stretch right across and to meet in the middle of Eurasia. They were stopped from doing so because of the 8-year war of resistance in Japan against the Japanese occupation. And it was finally recognized by Churchill and Roosevelt how important China's contribution to the war was. China had been divided up into different spheres of influence by the different imperialist powers, and which took little chunks of China along the coast. And in 1943, this semi-colonial status ended, and the Allies recognized China as an allied equal. And that is how China became the 5th member of the UN Security Council. The Chinese government, which at that time was a united front government between the nationalists and the communists, were part of the negotiations for the formation of the United Nations. And this is this is something that is extremely important to understand the Chinese point of view on the Pacific. So after 1950, the US, as I said, imposed the Cold War with the China, with the chain strategies, imposed a Cold War division, and basically settled the war with Japan on its own, and basically took over Japan's military, and settled peace with Japan without involving the main victims of the war, which were Korea and Japan. And as a result of that treaty between the US and Japan, there are various issues that were left unresolved, including the disputed islands that I mentioned earlier. So this is really, these points of conflict that we look at today are really leftover problems that weren't resolved because of the way in which the US took control over the Pacific, which they called our lake. From China's point of view, you know, it had earned the right to have a say in these things, and it had earned the right for Taiwan to be returned to China, that had cost them 20 million lives in the war. The other thing that was never really settled was the issue of Japan's war crimes. So, you know, why is all this important to us today? I think, first of all, you know, there's a lot of details here. And if you're new to this, it might seem a bit too much to take on board. But first of all, I think I just wanted to show the scale of the Pacific militarization under the United States. And secondly, to understand that there is a very complex history that is going on here. And that the situation that we face now is not really about the interests of the peoples, you know, whether it's Taiwan or the Pacific Islanders or whoever, the Southeast Asia. It's really about US dominance and how to preserve US dominance in the region. After the peace deal, the bilateral alliance between the US and Japan became a cornerstone in a series of bilateral alliances between the US and South Korea, between the US and Thailand, and so on, which basically is like a hub and spokes arrangement of US control. But now what is happening is, with the increased militarization, is that we're seeing links being built at the US behest in terms of, we have AUKUS, we have an upgraded military alliance now with Japan, which has become a full-scale military power, links with the Philippines, and so on. And this all is sort of developing into an Asian NATO. The other reason why I think it's important is because the US portrays China as hell-bent on world domination. And from China's point of view, it's about history. It's a question of history. As I said, it feels that it earned a place at the top table at the cost of 8 years of resistance and 20 million lives, and that this its part in the victory of World War II has not yet been fully realized. So that's the end of my background, really, and I'll come out of share screening and we can move on with the conversation.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Jenny. That's a really useful way to start the evening off. I wanted to, first of all, just ask a quick question about more recent history, and in particular about the changing attitude of the West towards China, because I guess it's important to understand what is driving this very deadly game from the point of view of the West. And for a long time, there was an argument that the West, and particularly the US, were so economically intertwined and dependent on China that war was unlikely, or even some people would have said impossible. And the US, to some extent, used to stress, the US establishment, foreign policy people used to stress cooperation over confrontation with China. And I wanted to ask, what do you think has changed in the last, I guess, 5 or 10 years that has moved the US away from more talk about cooperation towards more confrontation? And also, I'd ask you, as part of the same question, Britain appears to be at the forefront of the drive towards war, or the kind of escalation of rhetoric and military alliances. What's driving Britain's central involvement in this ramping up of tension with China?
Yeah, well, I think really the change, has come in the United States because its dominance, particularly of the Pacific, is under pressure from China's rise, and it's not prepared to relinquish or negotiate or renegotiate, if you like, its position. And I think that this change from engagement to containment really came with Trump. First of all, it was he that introduced the trade and technology wars. And then in the middle of COVID, which he was talking in a very racist way about the Wuhan plague. And then, Pompeo, his Secretary of State, stepped forward at the Nixon Center in 2020, was it 20? Yeah, 2020, and said that the engagement policy, that China had taken advantage of it and was raping the United States economy, and that this was the end of it. They were going to end it, and they were going to, revert to containment. I think that with Biden, people were hoping that he might take a less hostile stance. But of course, he carried on the policy, and even more so because he tried to rope in the allies. He realized that China cannot be defeated on its own, and that they have to build the relations with the allies. Of course, when you talk about the West, it's very complicated, the relation of Australia and Europe and so on and so forth. Let alone South Korea and countries in Southeast Asia. So it's really the United States that is kind of driving and, emphasizing an ideological difference of democracies, against autocracies, and then trying to put pressure on people to get into line. He's hyped up the China threat much more directly. Before, it was all about North Korea. It was really using that as a front for building up the militarization against China, and also switching the focus, from the South China Seas more towards Taiwan. So, and this, you know, this is really profoundly destabilizing. And some people say that it's, you know, it's just a bluff, that it's, you know, aimed at, you know, shifting China's behavior and getting China to back off. But nevertheless, you know, this is extremely costly in the first place. And secondly, you know, a war could very easily break out. You know, wars aren't started deliberately, they can start by accident. It's not just Taiwan, you know, and obviously Biden has been, you know, trying to provoke China. It's, you know, sending 500 US troops are there as trainers, which is breaking all agreements between the US and China. It's arming Taiwan, all the kinds of things that we saw in relation to the US and the Ukraine. And upping official visits with, you know, the Pelosi visit was really provocative. And all of this kind of heightening of the tensions kind of feeds into militarization and puts pressure on the allies to fall into line and to take the view that, you know, that China is the threat, which is what we saw, you know, Sunak flip-flopping, which was what we saw him to do. And of course, the UK is really heavily involved in the militarization, first of all, in AUKUS. And the whole point about those nuclear powered submarines is that they can reach undetected right the way up to the South China Sea. But the other thing is that's gone much more gone under the radar, is that all of a sudden we've got a military alliance with Japan. Japan is only supposed to have self-defense forces because of its role in the war. And its constitution says it renounces war, but clearly now the UK is enabling Japan with strike facilities, missiles that can land in China. And this is part of what's called this fighter jet deal that's they've worked out with Italy and Japan. And the other thing is that we also have what's called a reciprocal access. So this is just negotiated at the beginning of the year, a reciprocal access agreement in which British troops can go, will have access to Japanese soil. So that means that, and they actually took part in the military exercise, which was taking over an island that had come under foreign control or something. You know, this is preparing for a war over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, which are disputed between Japan and China. So Britain is really heavily involved. And like we've seen with Ukraine, you know, that time and again, the British government has stepped in and kind of led the way in with arms, in standing in the way of peace negotiations, and now it's doing the same thing. We sent our aircraft carrier first, then we have France and Germany, you know, sending their warships, paving the way for NATO to get more and more involved in the region. And of course now NATO is, you know, this is inch by inch, the American put pressure on, and bit by bit, these governments give way, and now NATO is going to open a headquarters in Japan. So clearly the line of direction, and Britain is playing a leading role, is to bring Japan and AUKUS together as containing China, as you know, against the China threat in an Asian NATO. And this is really, really inflammatory.
Yeah, it's a very dangerous situation. Thanks, Jenny. I wanted to move on to the question of Taiwan, actually, because I mean, all the commentators regard this as being the most likely flashpoint for a possible war. And I wanted to ask you why that is in particular, whether you agree, and also to just give us your take on the kind of power dynamics and the history involved in the relationships between Taiwan and China and Taiwan and the West.
Right. Well, a lot of this is centered on Taiwan and the dangers of war with Taiwan. And if we're talking about a war starting, it could be started by the United States, it could be started by Japan, but it's most likely that the US would try and provoke China to start the war. Now, this is because China sees Taiwan as a part of China, and that this was part of the agreements between the Allies at the end of World War II. So it feels that, you know, it's cost 20 million lives. This was part of a civil war. It was between the nationalists and the Chinese that broke out after 1945, and the nationalists were defeated in this civil war, and they set up in Taiwan. And the reason why the Chinese Communist Party, or the People's Republic, which was established in 1949, didn't pursue them was because the US stepped in and sent its aircraft carrier up the straits. And this was the beginning of the Cold War, which was the hot war with Korea. And so this was never resolved. And as I said, you know, the US took control. It set up its own separate peace with Japan. It decided on it decided to support the nationalists in Taiwan, and so the Chinese formula is now that they will use coercion if Taiwan declares independence, or if they think there is no possibility of peaceful reunification. And so this is what Biden is pushing against all the time, to aggravate China. And of course, you know, when China responded to Pelosi's visit by shooting ballistic missiles right the way over the Taiwan island, you know, this is extremely alarming. But what could China do? That if they just sat back, you know, then America would just, you know, set up Taiwan as a full military base, just, you know, 100 miles from the coast of China. So they're put in a very difficult position. Was there anything else about that?
No, that's great. Thank you for that.
I mean, I just want to say that, you know, that the main thing is that despite all of what's been going on over this, the Chinese are still maintaining that their preference is for peaceful reunification and for peaceful dialogue. And that's the important thing, because a war must not, this is one war that must not be allowed to start, because it would be entirely devastating, not only for China, not only for Taiwan, but also for China, given all of the military hardware, as I said, that there's all over the Pacific. But also for the world, because China is the major trading partner for 120 countries around the world. So this would pale against the kind of, you know, economic spillover effects that we're getting from the Ukraine war. So long as there is an opportunity to solve the problems peacefully through dialogue, then, you know, this is what we have to emphasize, and not allow this situation to escalate. You know, regardless of what differing interests there are, you know, this is the position of Stop the War, as I understand it, is people have to sort out their problems peacefully through dialogue.
Absolutely, absolutely. Just one last question from me, which is that as the tension mounts, we can expect the propaganda campaign to escalate as well. We know this from, well, from what's going on in Ukraine, but we know it from the history of the wars. And I just wanted to ask, I mean, obviously, it's very important, as in previous wars, that we don't allow our opponents to conflate being anti-war with necessarily supporting the regime of the government of the country under attack. How to deal with first of all, the questions that are raised about human rights in China, but also the accusations, and in certain sense, the reality of remilitarization that is going on, that is being conducted by the Chinese government at the moment.
Right. So I think that, first of all, on the question of remilitarization, I mean, where do we start? People know so little about China. I mean, the first thing, if I was just talking about China, where I'd start is China is a developing country. People, don't think that China is still a developing country. Its average per capita income is something like $12,000 as compared with the UK, which is about 45,000 in terms of dollars, and the United States, which is over 60,000. So there's a great discrepancy here. In this situation, China is modernizing its military, and it has been modernizing its military, over the years. But there's a very good quote by something like a lieutenant commander from the US Pacific Command a couple of years ago, who said that the Chinese military is 90% focused on sinking our ships and shooting down our planes. And so that military buildup is essentially trying to get control within, I mean, not to take over, but actually, to get the first island chain. China has one overseas base at Djibouti. The United States has, 700 around the world, over 300 around China. For China to actually catch up with that, I mean, we're just off in the realms of, I mean, this is, it would take decades. China doesn't have a missile defense system. It has 350 nuclear weapons, which are kept under no first use. The United States has 5,000 nuclear weapons. So these kinds of discrepancies. On the question of human rights, Stop the War doesn't condone human rights abuses. And we have to be clear about, we don't condone human rights abuses. That's not what we're here for. But what are human rights? And there's so much misinformation about China. It's very, very hard to form an opinion. So I think that, what we have to emphasize is that, the biggest abuse of human rights is to be dead. If you're dead, you don't have human rights. And look at the US record. What is it, Chris? I'm sure you know off the top of your head, something like 4.5 million deaths in the post 9/11 era. China, in terms of deaths overseas, 0. Even for all of the contention in the South China Seas, not a single shot has been fired. In fact, the Philippines have actually shot dead, I believe, they've shot dead a Taiwanese fisherman, and they've also shot dead some Vietnamese fishermen, but China has not fired a shot. So I think that we have to, in terms of the media, the media sets an agenda, and then, we're confronted with this, and we're trying to, think of which way, how can we get around this? And we have to set our own agenda, and we have to be very, very clear about, setting our own agenda about this, which is end of war, peace, focus on peace.
Thanks very much, Jenny. That was brilliant. So I'll throw